Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Racial Violence Hub series. I'm Shireen Razak, the Penny Canner Endowed Chair in Gender Studies at UCLA and the founder of the Hub. The Hub's purpose is to foster feminist and critical race scholarship. This scholarly exchange is on racial violence from a feminist point of view. This is the Genocide series, which began, it's hard to believe this, but it began in October of 2021, and it continues for one more time after this time. So the Genocide series is intended for those of us who are writing and thinking on racial violence, and specifically with efforts to wrestle with a number of issues, such as how to think about the politics of genocidal violence and the interconnections between its different registers, how to consider the transnational links between genocidal states, how to write about racial violence without spectacularizing it and trading in pain and suffering, how to minimize harm to the families and communities of those we write about, how to understand the specific context of racial violence, its geopolitical coordinates, its relationship to history, and how to understand resistance. So far, we began with categorical violence and the traffic in Asian women. We moved on to consider settler state genocidal tactics in Israel-Palestine, genocidal management through reformism in North America, administrative genocide against Muslim populations in South Asia, theorizing an indigenous feminist voice in relation to mass violence against Ottoman Armenians, genocide in the Americas, sexual and labor slavery and armed conflict in Guatemala, for instance. Today we have our last workshop, although not our last event. So the closing event will be on May 6th, 2022, Feeling Genocide, Matrifocality, and Black Church Arson. And that will feature Dr. Todney Thomas, who is Assistant Professor of African American Religious Studies at Harvard Divinity School. So stay with us until that last event for sure. Today's event is a really exciting panel. We have three speakers, two main speakers and a commentator. So we will start today with Dr. Jaskiran Dhillon, whose talk is entitled Protect the Nation, Defeat the Threats, Colonial Violence and the Securitization of the Canadian Northern Border in the Wake of Climate Catastrophe. Dr. Dhillon is an associate professor in global studies at the New School. Her scholarship, organizing, and teaching aims to work in the service of political movements, advancing decolonization, justice, and freedom across the world. The second speaker will be Dr. Athar Zia, whose talk is entitled Neocolonial De-Development in the Indian-Occupied Kashmir. Dr. Zia is an associate professor in anthropology and gender studies at the University of Northern Colorado, Greenlee. She is the founder editor of Kashmir Lit and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. Dr. Sunaina Mehra is our commentator today. She is professor of Asian American Studies at UC Davis. Her new community engaged project is focused on Yemeni Americans in Oakland and the impact of the pandemic, the Muslim bans, and the war in Yemen. Her ethnographic research highlights the experiences of Yemeni corner store owners and their families who've been essential workers on the front lines of the pandemic. Dr. Mehra produced digital stories with Yemeni and Arab Americans in the Bay Area that highlight alternative narratives of the COVID crisis, the humanitarian disaster in Yemen, the war on terror, Islamophobia, and community organizing. Dr. Mehra will offer some comments for today's speakers, but will also introduce some comments on the humanitarian disaster in Yemen. So we'll begin with Dr. Dhillon.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I want to start by thanking Shireen for this invitation. It's been really wonderful to listen to everyone's talks over the course of the series, and I really feel like I've learned so much. Always helps me with my own work. I'd also like to say thanks to Sarah for all of her work to help bring these sessions together, and express my gratitude to my two co-panelists for sharing the space with me and offering their deep insight, knowledge, and experience about the issues that sit at the center of our discussion this afternoon. Speaking to you today from Philadelphia, the territorial homelands of the Lenape people. So our session today is titled Land, Climate Change and Genocidal Violence, North America and South Asia. And my contribution to this conversation is anchored to a recent ethnographic project I have undertaken, a project that is in its relatively early stages, and even more so due to the pandemic and restrictions around travel. But it's situated at the intersection of conversations around climate change, Indigenous sovereignty, migration, and the militarization of the Arctic border against the backdrop of a long history of settler colonial state building and colonial violence in Canada. What I'm going to offer today is a glimpse into this work. This is the first time I'm actually presenting it in public, in fact, and share some of my preliminary thoughts about the analytic and political import of the project as it moves forward. So as I mentioned, the heart of this work revolves around exploring the current militarization and securitization of the Canadian northern border in the wake of climate change and the accelerated melting of the Arctic, closely examining historical patterns of settler colonial violence and border control in the region, as well as contemporary formulations of this violence. With respect to how I'm conceiving of racial violence in the context of the project, there are multiple dimensions I'm interested in interrogating, all of which call attention to the changing face of settler colonialism and related technologies of settler state governance. In other words, I'm interested in revealing emerging mechanisms of colonial violence and control that speak to our current historical moment. Histories and contemporary realities of land dispossession, forced relocation, gender violence, and environmental ruination are all part of this story. The melting of the Arctic offers an important line of sight into the ways that technologies of settler state formation and power are shifting as a result of climate change and perceived threats to state sovereignty. What does a close-up analysis or inquiry into the Canadian state's response to issues of climate change in the North allow us to understand about the future horizon of environmental ruination, border control, and Indigenous self-determination and resistance in the region? More specifically, I'm interested in understanding how colonial violence takes shape within this context, bringing visibility to the ways that the settler state of Canada becomes constructed as a legitimate and authoritative actor for mitigating perceived quote unquote threats, which I will say more about in a minute, while at the same time naturalizing the violence, much of which has been perpetrated by the state itself, that Indigenous communities in the North have endured for centuries. A couple of more points of clarification before I delve deeper into what's happening in the North and why we should be paying attention. First, I want to be clear that my point of departure for examining issues of climate change and environmental devastation in the Arctic is rooted in a conception of these things as forms of settler colonial violence. In other words, I want to emphasize that the temporal sensibilities that animate most liberal environmentalists' concerns are distinct from the sense of time experienced by Indigenous peoples who've had to survive environmental catastrophe since the initiation of the colonial project. From the vantage point of Indigenous resistance, the environmental crisis aligns with the time of colonialism. It is certainly not new. And there's obviously implications for this for how we think about Canada's approach to the militarization of the border. And second, I want to highlight the specificity of border violence, the social, political, historic, legal, capitalist, and geographic lines of containment, inclusion, and expulsion that mediate so much of how the world is organized, for whom and under what conditions, as it relates to this specific project. There is a large body of work, of course, which I can't go into now in the interest of time, that speaks to the way borders are one of the most clear and present markers of ongoing violence, of forced displacements, land dispossession, and extractivism, capitalist circulations, and gender violence that are required for colonialism and imperialism to flourish, for labor inequalities to be possible, and for related forms of stratification to continue. They signal deep and profound structural inequalities and hierarchies of race, class, gender, ability, and citizenship status that continue to produce the stakes of life or death for millions of people across the planet. Borders are sites of land struggles and struggles over identity and culture, but they are also sites of life-making and resistance. We know that colonial structures reproduce the politics of border control, who belongs, who doesn't, the maintenance of territorial integrity, and the elimination of Indigenous peoples required to build settler colonial states like the United States and Canada was dictated and sanctioned by the doctrine of discovery and notions of terra nullius, which of course uphold the political and international legal right for colonial powers to seize and claim ownership of land. I would like to suggest that a focus on Canada's northern border in this historical moment opens up a space to think through contemporary frontier logics as they're linked to a global political economy of capitalism and colonialism that is being deeply impacted by climate change worldwide and the assertion of Indigenous self-determination and movements for ecological preservation and environmental justice. So what is exactly happening and why should we be paying attention? Let's start with some basics about what constitutes the Canadian Arctic, which I have to say has taken me quite a long time to figure out. It's a rather challenging task given the contesting views about this and the magnitude of the region. According to maps published by the Canadian government, the boundary of the Canadian Arctic follows the 60th parallel north, dives abruptly south along the banks of the Hudson Bay, and then cuts back onto land as it crosses northern Quebec and Labrador. This massive swath of land represents over 40% of Canada's land mass, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Yukon, and the northern parts of several provinces. It represents 25% of the global Arctic and 160,000 kilometers of Canadian coastline. In terms of the physical landscape, it is also immensely diverse, ranging from the Inuit region of the high Arctic to the rocky Canadian Shield in Nunavut to the low-lying tundra of the Arctic coastal plains. It is generally divided into two zones, the Arctic and the subarctic. The former is characterized by permafrost, Arctic tundra, and polar deserts at high latitudes, while the latter lies to the south of the tree line and consists of boreal forests. The waterways, and this is an important point, that comprise the Canadian Arctic are also important to note. The Northwest Passage, which is the sea route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic Ocean, which Canada claims as an internal waterway, Baffin Bay, Hudson Bay, and the Beaufort Sea, as well as parts of the bordering oceans. The Canadian Arctic is home to approximately 150,000 people, of which more than half are Indigenous, including the Inuit, Dene, Athabaskan, and Gwinnett peoples. So now that we have a bit of a sense of what constitutes the region, I want to zoom out for a minute to consider the broader context of climate change that is profoundly altering the landscape of the North. For many Indigenous people living in the North, as well as scientists who have been studying climate change, it is clear that climate-driven changes are particularly pronounced within Arctic ecosystems. And again, I don't have time to go into all of the changes here. And let me tell you, this is really depressing stuff. But I do want to share a few findings from the 6th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was recently released. And this is important context for understanding the militarization and securitization project of the Canadian government in this moment. So we know that high Arctic sea ice has been in retreat since 1971, and increases in open water duration, which is the amount of time maritime traffic can travel across open water, has been in recent decades has been unprecedented. Additional reduction in polar sea ice is virtually certain. We know that there is a profound amplification of warming across the Arctic and a continental intensification of warming. In fact, the hottest temperatures ever recorded in the US Pacific Northwest and parts of Canada appeared in the summer of 2021, and this was referred to as the heat dome. Extreme heat waves are projected to intensify and become more frequent and longer in duration as average temperatures rise across North America. We know there are major disruptions to transportation routes in the North due to the melting ice, and obviously this is happening in the winter months. And we know that climate change has contributed to cascading environmental and sociocultural impacts in the Arctic that have adversely and often irreversibly altered northern livelihoods, cultural activities, essential services, health, food, and nutritional security, community connectivity, and well-being. So what is clear is that the social, political, and ecological landscape of the Canadian North is changing rapidly. Indeed, the looming possibility of an ice-free Arctic has Canadian politicians and security experts shaking in their boots. According to Jessica Shaden, an Arctic expert for the Government of Canada and a founder of Arctic 360, Canada is facing what she calls, quote, a once in a century opportunity to finally complete nation building in the country by putting our efforts for innovation and investment into the North, end quote. In response to this changing landscape, the settler state of Canada has undertaken a number of initiatives and foreign security policies designed to mitigate what they perceive as a growing list of potential threats to the sovereignty of the nation state. These perceived threats are articulated by the government as an increase in maritime traffic, which has grown substantially over the last several years due to the melting of the polar ice and the opening of waterways, rising international interest in the region as a potential site of future strategic land and water defense, as well as an ongoing site of natural resource extraction, technological innovations, for example, remote piloted systems and the development of artificial intelligence have made access to the region easier. And then the very likely possibility of millions of climate refugees who will be seeking respite and relocation in countries like Canada. Perhaps the sentiment of Canada's response is best captured in the words of Canada's first national defense strategy. In this document, they say, quote, "The Arctic is known to have vast reserves of fossil fuels and an abundance of minerals, including gold and diamonds, and is increasingly accessible due to climate change. Consequently, the region is attracting more and more Canadian and international attention. Because climate change is gradually eroding the Arctic ice cap, the waters of the Arctic archipelago are more navigable every year and more ships enter the region. Air traffic in the north is also growing. The increase in traffic at sea and air and the escalating exploitation of natural resources in the north boosts the sovereignty challenges, environmental problems, accidents giving rise to search and rescue requirements, and criminal activity, especially illicit entry of people. A central feature of the growing militarized defense in the north is the Canadian government's signature Arctic training program called Operation Anouk. And this is that program that sits at the center of my ethnographic project right now. Initiated in 2007 under the direction of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Operation Anouk utilizes the Canadian Armed Forces to deliver trainings now twice a year in multiple locations and develop partnerships between federal, territorial, municipal, and international political and military bodies in order to bolster Canada's response to the aforementioned changes. The focus of these training programs revolves around exercising what they call the defense and security of Canada's northern regions, and includes improving the ability to operate, improving the ability of the Canadian Armed Forces to operate in challenging environmental conditions, which require a unique skill set. And this is coupled with a series of what they call maritime presence activities. The next installation of Operation Anouk will take place in August of 2022 in and around Cambridge Bay and Pond Inlet. I first learned of Operation Anouk while I was in the Northwest Territories in the summer of 2015. I was there visiting friends and comrades and trying to understand the complex impacts of climate change in the region. And I've had the great fortune of being able to build a close relationship with an Indigenous elder in the area who has a long history of fighting for Indigenous sovereignty and environmental justice. His name is Francois Paulette. And I just had a conversation with him yesterday and made sure he was good with me sharing this aspect of my relationship with him in this public talk. He's a Dene Sioux Line member and member of the Smith's Landing Treaty 8 First Nation. Francois survived the residential school system before going on to become the youngest chief in the Northwest Territories Indian Brotherhood in 1971. In 1972, along with 16 other chiefs from the Mackenzie Valley, he challenged the Crown to recognize treaty and Aboriginal rights and title to over 450,000 miles of land in the historic Paulette case. He often refers to himself as an FBI, a fabulous big Indian. He is tall with a commanding presence. Long silver hair is usually tied in a ponytail and flowing down his back with a colorful bandana strategically tied around his head. He's almost always wearing camouflage. Francois and I, along with my daughter, who was 16 at the time and had accompanied me to this trip to the Northwest Territories, were returning from a day of exploring climate change impacts in the area and had stopped at a local grocery store to pick up a few things in the small city of Fort Smith. And when I walked into the grocery store, I noticed a flyer on the bulletin board in bold black letters that read, and this was all it said, "Operation Anouk is seeking volunteers for the summer training program. Please call this number." And then the number was listed. There was no other information on the flyer, so you can imagine my curiosity was piqued immediately. And so when we got back to Francois's truck, I asked him about it. And he started to explain to me that the Canadian Armed Forces, along with numerous other military agencies, including the US Coast Guard and other arms of the US Department of Defense, had been consistently increasing their presence in the region because of climate change. They are worried, he said, about the changes that are coming, and they want us, meaning Indigenous people, to help them. And this is not the only thing they are doing, Operation Nanook, I mean. In addition to that program, Canada is bolstering its reliance on surveillance technology. There's something newly being developed called the Canadian Air Defence Identification Zone, and then another whole surveillance mechanism that uses satellites to monitor day and night, and in all kinds of weather, all the marine and air traffic entering the region. And of course, the whole point of this is to monitor the airspace and waterways more effectively. They are also substantially increasing the number of RCMP and Canadian Rangers patrolling the north. As explained in the Canadian government's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, which I encourage all of you to read if you want to learn more about what's happening in the north around these things. Quote, the RCMP also has a key role in securing Canada's Arctic by providing policing services. Increasing international interest and activity in the Arctic will lead to escalated organized crime activity, irregular migration, human smuggling, and national security threats. To help respond through territorial police service agreements, there is a large RCMP presence increasing in the Northern Territories to help protect Arctic and Northern communities and ensure the safety of Northerners. The RCMP presence in the Arctic includes 61 detachments and 3 divisional headquarters, end quote. So what I would like to do with the little time I have left is to offer some preliminary considerations on what I've presented thus far, or some potential implications. And there are 3 main points I would like to make here. First, I'd like to suggest that Canada's approach to the Arctic undermines, obviously, Indigenous people's interests, knowledges, and movements for self-determination because they are largely defined by the government on the basis of defense and military considerations that have the potential to further promote conditions of insecurity and destabilization for Indigenous peoples living in the North. In the specific case of the Inuit, there are long-standing and devastating forms of colonial and racial violence that have been implemented in the name of settler state sovereignty, which include contemporary threats to Inuit people caused by colonial institutions attempting to ensure permanent settlement and assimilation. One need not look far to see how this story has played out in the recent past. From 1953 to 1955, for example, the Canadian government initiated the High Arctic Relocation Program, which forcibly relocated Inuit families to Craig Harbour and Resolute Bay to act as, quote unquote, human flagpoles in support of Canada's Arctic sovereignty. Sled dogs were slaughtered by the RCMP and Quebec provincial police between the 1950s and 70s as a means to force Inuit people off the land and into stationary living. And of course, the 2005 RCMP report, which was a self-investigation, so they investigated their own role in the slaughter of the sled dogs, absolved them of any wrongdoing or responsibility. And then there were multiple reports that were written by the Inuit in various places to contest these findings. Multiple and ongoing land claims that are a principal instrument for Inuit self-determination are still highly contested and unresolved. Climate change, of course, is also central here as since there has been inadequate or non-existent federal government climate change policy that not only includes Indigenous people in the decisions affecting their homelands, but in fact centers their knowledge, history, and approaches to ecological stability and conceptions of land, water, and air. There are major threats to Arctic wildlife and food security because of the scope and depth of climate change, which has come in part from a heavy reliance on Canada's staple economy that is inextricably tied to extracting the Arctic's natural resources. These are fraught colonial relations that reveal the complicated problematics associated with Canada's militarization and securitization of the northern border, notions of settler state security that obfuscate the role of Canada in producing conditions of grave insecurity and instability for Indigenous peoples since the inception of the colonial project. What I'm suggesting here then is that the border fortification in the high north provides a renewed opening for the Canadian settler state to further exploit border control for its own ends while enlisting Indigenous communities in this project. In the words of Vice Admiral Bob Ochterlani, commander for Canadian Joint Operations in the Armed Forces. He says, quote, as competitors seek to bolster their presence and increase military operations in the Arctic, we must remain vigilant, ready to protect our nation and to deter and deny and defeat potential threats. Our nation is no longer a geographic sanctuary. There's increasingly more competition in the air and on the land and at sea. Operation Inuk prepares us to anticipate, adapt, and act across these domains in defense of Canada and North America, end quote. The second point I want to make is that the increased military presence in RCMP in remote Indigenous communities raises serious concerns about colonial gender violence and police violence more generally, given the historic and present day reality of Indigenous people's experiences with police in Canada. And again, there is excellent work in this area, including the work of many people who have presented in this series. This seems especially important to consider given the policing of Indigenous-led resistance movements fighting against fossil fuel development and ongoing environmental damage initiated in the name of national security and critical infrastructure development in Canada. Take the Wet'suwet'en struggle against the Coastal GasLink pipeline as a case in point, where the RCMP were prepared to shoot Indigenous land defenders mounting a resistance against the pipeline. So embedded within Canada's approach to the militarization of the northern border is then a conception of land that vastly diverges from that of Indigenous peoples in the region, whose version of security will become prioritized with the increased military and police presence, who and what becomes demarcated as a threat, and who has the authority to decide and determine what actions should be taken. If Indigenous peoples recognize the settler state government itself as a security threat to their communities and lifeways, as they've articulated, how might state violence against them continue to grow, especially with the increase in presence of Canadian Armed Forces and RCMP in remote locations? And the last point I want to make here is that the preliminary analysis that I'm thinking through also carries significant implications for climate migration and the rise of climate refugees. Life-threatening environmental conditions across the globe are expected to produce 200 million climate migrants over the next 30 years. And Canada is being cited as one of the countries that is going to be most habitable as conditions worsen. Currently, there is no international legal category for climate refugees, which translates in part into countries like Canada also falling short on developing clear mandates for how to address this crisis on humanitarian grounds. But it is clear that Canada's evolving defense strategy, which includes Operation Inuk, is keenly aware of the likelihood of increased migration due to climate change. One of the most disturbing things that I discovered while I was doing the research for this talk was that the training operation for Operation Inuk, which took place in 2021, included what they're calling a mass casualty exercise at Resolute Bay. And while the specifics of this are not yet clear to me, I'm filing right now freedom of information requests on a bunch of these things. I was left with this grave sense of concern about the future of climate migration and what it will look like in Canada, given the framework for Arctic and Northern defense as it stands right now, and also how Indigenous people are going to be some of the arbitrators of what happens around climate migration, as given the demographics of who lives in the North. And I'm going to close on this point, and I have to share this just because, I didn't know what to do with it myself, but this sense of concern was only amplified further when I read a comment from Jody Thomas, who's Justin Trudeau's top national security advisor, who recently reiterated that the US and Canada are ready to defend the Arctic if necessary. She said, quote, "The United States and Canada would respond strongly if little green men showed up on Ellesmere Island," end quote. And on that note, I will end. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Dillon. Let's move now to Dr. Zia.
Thank you, Shireen, for inviting me, and thank you to the panelists for sharing the space with me. I will be talking about Kashmir, and the title of the talk, it kind of is what I had originally provided, but it might waver from the title a little bit because I think there's a lot more thinking that I was able to kind of move into after I started thinking about the things that this panel made me think. So the title of the talk is Neocolonial De-Development, but we can also think about it as maldevelopment in the Indian occupied Kashmir. So as most of you know, that my research field is Kashmir, specifically the Indian occupied Kashmir. This name is often mistaken for wool or a sweater, But the fact is that this is a small nation or country or peoples, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes it's also referred to in the colonial tropes as this green valley, which has these abundant streams and waters and meadows. But there is a lot of invisibilization of what it is as a territory and as people. What is worse in the common parlance today regarding Kashmir is that this is a place of violence and terrorism. And this gets even worse when the two countries talk about the Kashmiris or Kashmir, especially India, Pakistan very less so, that this is just a border dispute between the two countries. I'm going to be reading the paper, so hopefully I'll stay within time and not deviate too much. So Kashmiris are stakeholders in this resistance movement that is currently going on. And but the demands that Kashmiris are making, they are being invisibilized as violence in the geopolitics of these big neoliberal nation states. And the movement inside Kashmir as we speak has been effectively criminalized. Even human rights defenders and journalists are in jail currently, not just the political activists. The Indian government in 2019, it framed a removal of Kashmir's autonomy, which was done through military means, a military siege that lasted more than 2 years, as development of the region. And that's where we kind of like converge a lot. And on the ground, what was actually happening was that Indian settler colonial policies in Kashmir were unfolding. So in my mind, I was actually watching the 1947 in Palestine, or we probably were watching 200, 300 years back here on Turtle Island. That's how it kind of like is unfolding in my mind. So the other thing, what we are essentially watching right now is India's neo-colonial project unfold in Kashmir. So while my focus is what is the historical territory of the region of Kashmir, but the question that Kashmir raises are of global significance. And I think that's what the solidarity here today is. And in this moment, I feel that Kashmir forces us to think about questions that pivot around neo-imperialism, settler colonialism, and post-colonialism, as well as democracy. So I'm going to talk about all of these. So if they are not coherent, my apologies, but I'm also thinking through all of these things because these things have been thought about from the vantage of other peoples, but not Kashmir. That's my understanding at this moment. And there might be some literature out there that I'm not cognizant of. Please draw my attention to that or provide that. So the questions around post-colonialism and decoloniality, and also this question is of how Britain was able to create these legal options for peoples and enforce it on them. And in this historical moment, how is it that we adhere to those? Like, this is what Britain decided in 1947 for this region. And now Kashmiris have to abide by it under the UN resolution. So I think that's also something we should be thinking about when we think about Kashmir. And also, what does post-coloniality or post-colonialism mean for the region and its peoples, the Kashmiris? Considering military occupation that is prevalent in Kashmir right now, did colonialism ever leave Kashmir? So that becomes very potent for Kashmiris who cannot even speak today. In the 1970s, the focus across disciplines was to understand colonialism, and it evolved into understanding post-colonialism, which became a major analytical lens in the 1980s. Both singly and together, their embrace signaled an attack on perspectives deemed outmoded and inadequate for understanding of the global world order. Post-colonial theory included the study of aftermath of Western colonialism and believed that decolonized people developed a post-colonial identity based on interaction between different identities put into a hierarchical structure by the colonial society. Thus far, nation states like India have been understood in these terms and quite successfully. But where do zones like Kashmir and Kashmiri people fit into this context? Those people that are in the edges of these nation states, in the frontiers, in context, and I'm not talking about borders because I don't think Kashmir and borders necessarily align. In context of Kashmir, post-colonialism might be guilty of hiding as much as it has exposed, even though post-colonialism often describes the concurrent project to reclaim and rethink history and agency of people subordinated under various forms of imperialism. Given the tangible focus on big nation states, it does not suffice to understand coerced people in the edges who are kept hidden in plain sight. For Kashmir, there is very little post to colonialism. Rather, colonialism has been a continuity which only changed forms. It was further complicated by the insertion of electoral democracy, rather invoking the specter of democracy, a modern-day Eurocentric deity that is worshipped with blind faith. In context of Kashmir, I refer to democracy weaponized as politics to tame people, which is not the ideal of freedom and choice that democracy is often mistaken for. Then how does democracy shape in Kashmir, and who is deploying democracy? Is it the same Eurocentric Westphalian democracy imported to the rest of the world, and to which the post-colonial countries must adhere unquestioningly? If this is that democracy, for whom does it exist, and how does it exist? If a democratic system is producing conditions of extreme emergency and exception, such as Kashmir, how do we understand that democracy itself? And how are we to question it, and in what ways? While being a product of its unique history, the Kashmir question is also a democracy question as to how the system put in place in the subcontinent is rigged for violence and to create conditions of possibility to seed more violence in service of a new nationalism. In Kashmir, the only prevailing mode of Indian biopower is what, sorry, my table decided to go up. In Kashmir, the only prevailing mode of Indian biopower is what Ekil Membe calls necropolitics. As a decolonial analytic, necropolitics focuses on how governmentality operates in a system of hegemonic, neoliberal, and neocolonial violence, dictating who may live and who may die. In 1989, a popular armed movement started in Kashmir against the Indian government, demanding the right to self-determination and plebiscite as promised by the United Nations. Kashmir, along with Palestinians, is one of the first disputes on the UN agenda. The Indian government imposed Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which gives Indian military and paramilitary forces unlimited powers to act with impunity. Gross human rights violations have resulted in more than 100,000 killings, both of combatants and civilians, and more than 10,000 plus enforced disappearances. Rape has been used as a weapon of war, mass incarcerations, injuries like world's first mass blinding. There's also a Human Rights Commission report on that, 2018 and 2019. So currently in the Indian occupied Kashmir, there are approximately 700,000 plus troops with Kashmiri population of approximately 8 million or less. There is one soldier for every 8 Kashmiris, making Kashmir as one of the densest militarized regions. The troops in Kashmir come from the army, the paramilitary, and different formal units of the Indian National Forces, which at 1.1 million soldiers is the second largest in the world. So in a way, while I talk about Kashmir, I'm also kind of trying to think about decolonizing democracy or trying to decolonize post-colonialism, because in case of Kashmir, this lens does not work. So here I do want to reiterate what Ferit Guhen, a professor of philosophy, reminds us in his treatise on decolonizing democracy, 2015. He states, to engage in a critique or even a deconstruction of democracy does not mean that one cannot defend certain values which are associated with democracy, such as freedom and equality. Moreover, the fact that democracy has philosophical and political problems does not necessarily make it an inferior to non-democratic systems. However, uncritical affirmations of democracy under all circumstances makes us overlook meaningful distinctions among so-called democratic values and render us incapable of realizing how democratic practices turn into very non-democratic procedures that they fight against. He argues that globalization of democracy has to be theorized as post or neo-colonial or post or neo-imperialist phenomena. This is more than evident in Kashmir, but also everywhere in the so-called post-colonial nations. Post-colonialism is almost accepted as a monolithic condition and worn as a badge of honor by many nations, including India. And I find that very problematic, this unquestioning stance of what it means for peoples like Kashmir. And then to think about United States. the land where I stand on right now. The spectrum of conversation here in this panel today traverses the length and breadth of this country, and also how the United States' sovereign power impacts people in its center and margins and those continents away. How do we understand, accept, and acknowledge and practice the ideals of democracy here, while standing on an active site of genocide and constant tragedies of settler colonialism? Or the constitutive role of colonial dispossession in shaping democratic values and ideals here in the US? In his book titled Empire of the People, Adam Dahl centralizes the concept of disavowal, reiterating that disavowal of native dispossession is not politics of forgetting. It's simply a passive ignorance of native life forms in the historical archive of colonial violence, but an active refusal to historically and ethically grapple with the presence and political claims of indigenous peoples, as well as colonial violence that paved the way for the emergence of the modern American democracy. The oft-repeated discourse and the nationalistic narrative of American democracy takes into cognizance the icon of colonial settlement with the ethos of resistance and fight against the mother country, hard work, industriousness, and agricultural successes, building on a landscape painted as desolate, underutilized, and emptied of First Nations, which is so reminiscent of what the Israeli settler colonial state talks about when it talks about the Palestinian state. Their discourse conveniently omits the colonial dispossession of indigenous peoples and engineers a distinct emptying of territorial ground of democracy of its prior inhabitants and disavowing the presence of indigenous orders. Thus, in the settler democratic thought, the absence of native conquest is not assumed or forgotten, it is discursively produced. When seen for what it is, America is anti-colonial only when framed in context of its resistance and revolt against the British Crown, not when juxtaposed with the colonial dispossession, in which case the only lens to look at it is that of settler colonial expansionist empire. This disavowal continues to be active and produces an indigenous absence so deep that scholars like me who flock to Western shores do not realize till very late that they have stepped into someone else's nightmare. To research and write and advocate injustices of settler colonialism continents away while standing in an active one is to be part of multiple colonialisms, a lens which traces converging and coeval structures and histories within our lived experiences, analysis, and politics in the present. This I take from the work of Dia DaCosta from a special issue that was prepared in 2019. In this, we are all implicated. How then do we decolonize settler democracy here, or thinking of how it is unfolding back in Kashmir, if at all we can think about it in those ways? It is evident that most democratic political order stands on what Walter Benjamin, we can never be too decolonial, we always have to go back to some of the tropes, has called founding a violence or lawmaking violence, a process by which the elimination of native life forms enables the constitution of new legal, cultural, and political norms. Foundational violence that has established this basis of this democratic sovereignty. Thus, the overt and covert condoning by powerful democracies around the world, including US, of what happens in Kashmir, in whatever measure, at the hands of democratic India, quote unquote democratic, and for that matter, Palestine is the part and parcel of, or for the lack of a better term, colonizing democracies. The affirmation of settler colonialism camouflaged within the symbolics of democracy is not a mutation or a variant, but part of the original DNA of democracy, and that's being transported to other parts of the world. Such geopolitics also needs to be framed within the European expansionist policies. And here I'm not drawing lazy similarities between peoples and histories of the colonized, not between histories of the colonizers, but my focus is to pinpoint to the nature of democratic settler colonization, which Kashmir is facing since the formation of India, and which came to head in 2019 after India militarily removed Kashmir's autonomy and territorial sovereignty, and the world was still okay with all of that was happening and unfolding. So here I do want to talk a little bit, briefly trace the contours of India as it's stereotyped, or at least till recently, till BJP kind of unraveled and showed the imperial heart and the supremacist heart that it harbors as the world's brightest democracy. Also for the last half a century, the leader of subaltern school of thought and post-colonial theory. Since 1947, India has built a reputation on its democratic, pluralistic, and socialist ideals, its leadership in NATO till it waned, export of yoga, yet it can occupy Kashmir in the most brazen and open manner. In 1948, the issue of Kashmir and Palestine was amongst the first on the agenda of the newly formed United Nations. Yet in the contemporary geopolitics, Kashmir is often relegated to a simple bilateral or a territorial conflict, or even an issue of terrorism, and everything is kind of accepted by the rest of the world. Over the years, the right to self-determination of Kashmiri people, as mandated by the UN, has conveniently been sidelined and effectively criminalized. The Cold War politics facilitated the Indian government in gradually downgrading Kashmir to the point of calling it domestic matter and a law and order situation. And after 9/11, it has further subsumed Kashmiri resistance under the stereotype of Islamic terrorism. And in 2019, of course, here I might reiterate that since 2019, after the siege and the military re-annexation, there was some re-internationalization of the issue. And it's not as if India is getting away with the narrative. There are counter narratives that are concretizing and that are being made more visible. So the hegemonic Indian discourse around Kashmir, which completely negates the region's history and people's voices, can be understood through the lens of sanctioned ignorance. And here I actually have to go back to thinking with a post-colonial scholar, Gayatri Spivak, who in 1919 gave this idea of sanctioned ignorance, where she talks about tracing the Western colonial silencing of Native people's voices and histories and dismissing of a particular context as being irrelevant and fostering an institutionalized and ideological way of presenting the world. Spivak's focus is on the indigenous scholars and students who are silenced in educational institutions, which are predominantly Western European in their intellectual and philosophical traditions. While Spivak, as a leading voice of the subaltern school and post-colonial thought, deploys sanctioned ignorance to understand how Western hegemonic knowledge and ethnocentric research have justified colonial context. In context of Kashmir, the Western colonial domination for me in that layer is replaced by Indian hegemonic discourse that invisibilizes Kashmiri history and demand to fuel its settler colonial policies inside Kashmir. The Indian discourse projects Kashmir as if it had no political history, no identity or aspiration prior to India becoming a country. The desire for self-determination is treated as deviance, an anomaly, and the voices of Kashmiris are suppressed and their resistance is criminalized. Thus, this sanctioned ignorance is as active, like the disavowal around the colonial dispossession of First Nations. In the Indian discourse, Kashmir is not an international dispute that needs to be solved, but it's rather adamantly projected as a domestic dispute to be handled internally. For decades, Indian explanations of Kashmir dispute have dominated, in which Pakistan is solely made hyper visible as the enemy state. A vested silence is maintained on the policies of the Indian government and the barbarity of its military occupation, which began in 1947 and even before 1947. The focus in the Indian narrative, including popular and political culture from the secular parties to the religious ones that are currently ruling, is to weave Kashmir seamlessly into the Indian nation state. In popular discourse, the idea of honor, nation exists around an issue such as Kashmir that have set limits of legitimacy and which shape political and policy discourse. The limits of legitimacy line up with the contours of sanctioned ignorance about what is held true and false about Kashmir in the Indian discourse. In this context, the Indian vantage becomes legitimate and Kashmiri's stance becomes illicit. Kashmiris are cast as uniquely violent, patriarchal, framed in the erroneous stereotype of quote-unquote Islamic terrorism or terrorists, who are not in sync with democracy and development. In fact, these were the strawman arguments used by the Indian government in 2019 to completely erase Kashmir's autonomy. Primarily, the argument was used to given to strengthen democracy inside Kashmir and develop Kashmir. Development being a shorthand to neo-imperial and extractive looting of the resources. And it served its purpose, and very few questions were asked of what India was doing inside Kashmir. Nearly all 8 million Kashmiris were imprisoned in their homes under a curfew and communication lockdown. There was complete blackout, no phones, no internet, not even basic cable television. While curfews, communication bans, and lockdowns are not new to Kashmiris, the intensity and the duration of the siege sent a shockwave across international community. India broke its own record in the longest internet shutdown, over 8 months, which continued partially through COVID-19 pandemic. The crisis became so grave that Genocide Watch put out an alert on the region, and Lancet wrote an editorial on the ensuing humanitarian crisis. A doctor in Kashmir sat in the streets asking for some internet access so that patients could access care. A woman gave birth walking 6 miles. And for months, people here in the diaspora and all across the globe, all Kashmiris, they lost contact with anyone who resided in the region. Yet India was able to maintain its democracy. Necropolitics becomes apparent in a situation of siege or camp where dissidents and unwanted populations are detained in order to make it easy to govern, control, harass, and annihilate them. Kashmir is a de facto camp, occupied and militarily controlled with impunity and zero accountability, resulting in cessation and abuse of human rights and civil rights. The laws imposed on Kashmir are evidence of India's colonial constitutionalism that perfect its necropolitical practices inside Kashmir. In the Indian nationalistic vision, Kashmiris have become killable, the quintessential disposable body that can be killed without remorse for the sake of their national unity and preserving their democratic ideals. And again, we must think about this type of democracy. The Indian government says the removal of Kashmir's autonomy, as I said earlier, is for development, but it is inherently for de-development or mal-development. I mean, really, those categories don't even matter, as Kashmiris are day in and day out, and we cannot even keep track of the laws that are being changed as they are consistently dispossessed. But these are embedded in a structure of neocolonialism, which is based on fundamentalist Hindu ethno-nationalism or Hindutva, and is fueled by neoliberalism. And I think that is something that is common to all of them. And that is something that we can look through. And in that, Kashmir and US or Canada, thinking about all of these places, Palestine, they're not any different. Even the Rohingyas are not any different. The fear Kashmiris had of losing the last handle on their territorial sovereignty has come true and has paved way for full-fledged settler colonialism, dispossession of indigenous people, and rampant exploitation of resources, resulting in neocolonial maldevelopment. In a broader neocolonial context, the erasure of Kashmir's autonomy is also the fruition of ideology of Hindu indigeneity, in which Muslims living in India are cast as invaders and foreigners. And in that, Kashmiris are doubly marked as the other. First as Muslims, and the second as Kashmiris who are committed to an irrepressible struggle for their United Nations mandated plebiscite and a democratic sovereignty. I think I'll stop here, and then maybe the rest will come up in questions. Thank you.
So now we'll go to Dr. Mehra.
Thank you. That was really, really powerful. And I too am digesting the really profound insights that both Jaskaran and Arthur have shared. And it's so wonderful to hear from you again, Arthur, since we met in person at Davis and Jaskaran. It's really wonderful to be able to hear about your amazing and important work as well through this virtual forum. There's so much to say, and I also really want to hear from people who are here in this Zoom space, including some of my students. I'm so happy that they are going to have the honor to hear from these brilliant scholars who are working, in various settler and colonial contexts. So there are three concepts that I feel are threads that connect these two wonderful presentations. So in my mind, the three notions that really stood out for me that I'd like to grapple with more in our discussion is one, that of borders. So here we have two really interesting papers that are both about sort of northern border zones. And I know Arthur feels very strongly about why Kashmir should not be considered a border issue. And I think that's a really important point to tease out. But for the sake of a certain kind of optic, these are both sort of northern border sites where we see these issues of state and colonial violence playing out. The second concept that really struck me that you both are addressing is that of sovereignty. And then we have multiple conceptions of sovereignty within your layered analyses: settler sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty, and that is something I would love to tease out a bit more. The third the third thread that seems to be a really taut one is that obviously of militarism, warfare, but also I'd like to add war by other means, because I think what both of you are talking about is the ways in which there is not just the dramatic form of violence by, kind of militarized warfare, but there is also the slow death of genocidal violence, which brings us back to the overarching theme for this particular series. And so if we're going to think about genocidal violence as a kind of overarching concept, I just can't help thinking about the discourse around Ukraine at present, because it so suffuses our daily experience of the news and of media. And much has been said about the hypocrisy and, of the frenzy around the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because, the US happens to be on the side of this particular invaded community. And I think as anti-war, critics, as those who oppose militarized violence, obviously I too oppose this horrendous and tragic invasion. But all of the examples that you have offered us today, Jessica and Arthur, point to the ways in which, the kind of racialized violence in other sites has always been invisible. And in fact, Yemen is one of those sites. The war in Yemen has, we could say been going on for 8 years, but actually it's been going on much longer. It's also a war that began under a so-called liberal democratic president. The first African-American president of the US, Obama, actually began the drone war. Yemenis have been droned, bombed, and banned for over 8 years. And the silence is deafening, around the supposed humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And both of you also alluded in various ways, implicitly and explicitly, to this idea of humanitarian crisis. And so Yemen has been defined as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, at least until the crisis in Afghanistan in the fall, when the US committed its latest disaster on the Afghan people. But it is one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And this to me is another problem. To translate genocidal violence through the lens of humanitarianism, which depoliticizes it, right? And so what we have in Yemen is a US-backed, Saudi-led devastation of a whole nation and erasure of a people. And so I think it's not just the question of the lack of, sort of humanity that would warrant this to be acknowledged as a humanitarian crisis. It's simply the non-existence of Yemeni people, indigenous people, as well as other communities that have lived in Yemen. Yemen has long been a node in migration across the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. So in fact, we have East African peoples in Yemen. We have African refugees. We have South Asians who have also lived in Yemen. And Yemen also was another site of British colonization in the South, in Aden. And so I'm really struck by the ways in which both your papers help me think about this question of border zones. And, while you were speaking, Jessica, and in particular, I recalled this work by Sandro Mizadra and Brett Nielsen that I just want to comment on for a second. Their book is called Border as Method. And there's one thing that I just wanted to share, because I think the way they're thinking about borders is really productive. And so they actually conceptualize borders as a method, not as a spatial location. And they say borders are at once spaces of control and spaces of excess, at once sites for the restriction of mobility and sites of struggle. So not just border as wall. They really want to move away from this notion of the border as just the securitized wall, but also as a mechanism that actually controls flows and articulates movement. Second, borders are social institutions. So again, border not just as a line, but as a political and social institution involved in producing the very conditions for governance and governmentality. And so understanding the relations between these claims means analyzing how borders seek to, in quotes, produce governable mobile subjects from ungovernable flows. So I know Arthur has, rightly critiqued this idea of Kashmir as being a border conflict, and I do really respect that. But I think if we think about border as method, then we can also think about Kashmir and possibly even Yemen as a lens. And so I want to ask you all if you can just talk more specifically about the conception of sovereignty that your work would help us to address. So can you tease that out a little bit more? Because, we hear sometimes when we do hear about Kashmir, we hear about notions of Azadi, the slogan Azad Kashmir. So I'd like to hear more about what that actually means. And the other question that I have, I actually wanted to ask Jaskaran a little bit also about surveillance in Operation Nanook. I mean, such an unfortunate name. And this idea of the settler state as also being a surveillance state. So I recalled, how Andrea Smith talks about the problem in surveillance studies in not acknowledging that surveillance is taking place specifically by a settler state. And that literature leads to a not seeing of the settler state and a not seeing by the settler surveillance state. So it's not just that the surveillance state is trying to look at things or perceive things, it's what it doesn't see. And so in my own work with Yemeni Americans, I've been struck by how the war on terror has shifted to a level that is really so under the radar, pardon that pun, that in fact, those who are impacted by it are living in this reality that other people are not aware of. And what I mean by that is that there's a covert policing that is really invisible and invisibilized, and that has been going on, well beyond 9/11. And yet people outside Arab and Muslim and Swana communities are really not aware of this. My own students made decisions about where to go to college based on the fact that they were under FBI surveillance, they and their families constantly. And so there's an invisible travel ban, invisible mobility ban that has impacted Muslim and Swana communities, which is not talked about. Like everyone came to SFO and protested the bans at the airports, and then they went home, of course. But there's this ongoing unofficial travel ban that immobilizes people because of covert immigration restrictions, immigration delays, passport confiscations in Sana'a in Yemen, and also the disruption of cross-border flows. So the last comment that I just want to make that your papers inspired me to think about is the ways in which the transnational lives and survival strategies of Yemenis have been disrupted. Because Yemenis long lived lives across borders. They had kids in Yemen, they were working here, they were building homes in Yemen, they had families over here, they went back and forth, and they supported the Yemeni state through transnational remittances, given that it's one of the poorest states in the region. And all of those transnational, social, cultural, economic, and political ties have been disrupted well beyond the official Muslim ban. And then the last question, if Arthur, if you care to address this, like I really, really appreciate your unflinching critique of the Indian state's occupation and colonization of Kashmir. I am curious about a Pakistani lens on Kashmir, because again, I almost feel like it's easy to critique the Indian state because I mean, it's just so atrocious, right? And it should be critiqued even more because I think beyond our milieu, it's not, it's true. But having lived in Lahore a little bit, I think that many Pakistani leftists are also really frustrated with the lip service that is given to Kashmir in Pakistan. So from the perspective of yet another frontline state in the war on terror that is a militarized client state of the US, how can we think about how Kashmir would be framed in that context, given that Pakistan has its own Kashmir? I mean, the repression of the issues of sovereignty in Balochistan are also incredibly violent. I mean, that is another red flag issue not to talk about on Zoom probably for me. But I want to say that it is actually a border state in a global war on terror. And so I think there's some paradoxes there. So I'll just end there. Thank you so much.
The richness of this conversation is tremendously exciting, and everybody must want to be a part of it. While we are going to hear from the panelists as they respond to this amazing commentary, so thank you very much, Sunaina. I want to advise everyone that if you have questions, you could put it in the chat and I'll pick it up and pose it, or you could pose it yourself directly after. But let's return to the panelists to get their responses to this commentary. Maybe start with Dr. Dillon again.
Sure. Thank you so much for those really insightful comments. And I think, Sunaina, and you know, like you, and sounds like many other people, I feel like as I was listening, I took furious notes, and I was also making a lot of connections, and you know, thinking through the multiple dimensions of the presentations. So I'll just, I guess I'll respond to the question about, I also really think the sort of concept of, I'll just say this quickly as an aside, sort of border as method is very, very much resonant with how I'm thinking about the Canadian northern border, because it is a whole set of social political infrastructure and technologies that are part of the way that the militarization and the defense of the quote unquote defense of the border is happening. So that's really, really helpful. And I might email you just to make sure I got the reference right for that citation to look up that book. And then in response to sovereignty, the question about sovereignty, and then I'll take quickly the question about surveillance. I'm really thinking about sovereignty through the lens of kind of long-standing work alongside. I'm speaking about Indigenous sovereignty now, Indigenous nations around territorial land claims, governance authority, jurisdictional authority over their territories, and and it's sort of a tricky word because it sort of ties obviously to Westphalian state systems and thinking about political sovereignty in relationship to nation state building and settler nation state building. But I think because it's part of the vernacular and kind of the discursive register through which questions around treaty rights in places like Canada kind of take hold, it's an important assertion around claims to territory, and then consequently your ability to be able to control how that territory gets used and who lives on that territory and under what conditions. And obviously the corollary is true for the settler state, right? It's a consistent assertion of power and jurisdictional authority over the landmass that is demarcated as Canada. And the sort of contestation between these things that I think plays out in these really profound ways in all of these settler colonial projects that we're talking about. And I really, really appreciated your emphasis on kind of thinking through surveillance and various forms of violence through the kind of covert and overt formulations. And you're absolutely right that there are the formal systems, right, instituted by the state that are sort of engaging in the process of attempting to see particular kinds of things. But at the same time, there are absolutely all of the informal mechanisms of surveillance and kind of control and sort of the kind of slow violence in the everyday that initiates a form of self-regulation and self-governance. And I really saw this when I was in Wet'suwet'en territory doing the work around the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Kind of the geographic isolation of some of those communities also creates a whole other set of really difficult challenges to think through around surveillance and also kind of covert operations of the government in all kinds of formulations. And this means that the state extends much farther. The carceral state extends much farther than just the kind of formal RCMP and various other forms of law enforcement agencies into other state institutions that are part of the everyday life of people in those communities. So that's absolutely part of how I've been thinking about in my prior work, questions of regulation and control and surveillance and racial and colonial violence. And this project is, as I'm sure you can tell, it's still in its really early stages. And so there are many, many directions it has the possibility to go, and it's huge at this point. So all of this is really going to help me think through the next stage of it. I'm also slightly, I'm also thinking about the sort of kind of public presentation of and sharing of this information as I'm trying to get Freedom of Information Act requests through, and also be able to, enter, find my way into the next training program for Operation Anouk in the summer. I'm going to turn it over to you, Arthur.
Thank you, Jaskier. And thank you, Sunaina, for all your comments. And there's a lot here. I don't know what exactly I want to talk to, but I do want to first speak to the thing about borders. I don't want to say anything, just think about borders, because if I say anything else. So I like the idea of, I mean, I'm not against how one can theorize and see how borders exist in certain places and what kind of work they do. And I know that you worked on my border article for your special issue, and which is why this is so foregrounded in your memory regarding me. I think my resistance to the word border is because it has been deployed very violently when you talk about Kashmir. And even so, it's almost like, and this violence, as we have talked before long back, is not only embedded in the Indian nation states vocabulary, but it's also, the violence is so profound and deep that it's also embedded in people's lexicon, daily usage of words. So for example, I mean, one of the things that I try to kind of keep foregrounded is that there is no international border between the two Kashmirs. There used to be a ceasefire line, which was drawn in 1948. And then in 1971, the two nations, India and Pakistan, got together. They changed the nomenclature of the ceasefire line to line of control. Again, it's not a border, and without consulting Kashmiri people. And at that time, Pakistan had, Bangladesh had recently been truncated, and there were several things that the two countries were doing as two countries and not taking Kashmiris into consideration. And then you had the nomenclature became the LOC, which is line of control. But again, how do people refer to this line, and how do people, and the line is not only just a line or a division, but it's also division of people, which has had a deep political impact on the politics inside Kashmir and how Kashmiris see themselves as Kashmiris. So I think that's why I have this resistance, not because I don't want to think through borders in that manner, but what they do and how they're deployed when we talk about Kashmir, and what kind of a disservice it has done for the longest possible time to Kashmiri problem, and how it has invisibilized the problem as if it's a border dispute, even though technically it does exist as a dispute between these two nation states. It is on their frontiers, which is what I find is the easiest word to use, the frontiers or whatever we might call it. So I think that's where my resistance to the word is. Otherwise, I see it completely okay to use the word border, but maybe not when we're talking about the specific issues within Kashmir. I think it's also a way of educating the rest of the world, because what has happened in the last 60 years is that, there's generations of people who have already passed, who don't know Kashmir in the same manner as probably their grandparents did, or, someone from even Madeleine Albright, her dad was one of the UN plebiscite administrators, and he was also the ambassador, and he was also, he has a book, The Danger in Kashmir. He's written a book on Kashmir, and he's talking about Kashmir. And when you read that, it's a different kind of a state altogether. It's written in the 1950s, 1955 or 59, something like that. And to me, even as a Kashmiri, the lexicon was completely different, the way he's speaking about Kashmir, and which to me felt like the violence that language had done to Kashmiri movement, or to Kashmiri resistance, or to Kashmiri self-determination was, it's kind of like taking me. I mean, it's only now I probably speak a complete paragraph without second guessing or without kind of like correcting myself, because everything is so laden, and so just the idea of democracy in Kashmir. I mean, what kind of, we have to really take into cognizance that there is no democratic setup inside Kashmir. It's a weaponization of electoral system. So when a lot of people say regarding Kashmir that democracy wasn't given a chance inside Kashmir, and I keep thinking that democracy was never present inside Kashmir. So there was no question of given a chance. And I see these parallels now that I'm living in someone else's nightmare, I'm working in someone else's nightmare. Every day I'm kind of contended with that reality. And I see these, I kind of see that that's what we are all contending with. We are basically contending with settler democracies, which are actually set up for the benefit of some, and it has to annihilate these other people. And it's fueled by the neoliberal capitalistic order. And I think that's where the question of sovereignty also lies for me. Not just, we talked about indigenous sovereignty, settler sovereignty. I think even thinking about the sovereignty of Kashmir, how is it possible that there is a truce between two peoples? Now, the question of Kashmir's autonomy that was signed by collaborators and client politicians in 1949 between Kashmiris and Indian state, and which was contested by many Kashmiris. But one of the things that Kashmiris held onto from that truce, from that autonomy, was the territorial sovereignty part, that Kashmiris hold the right to franchise, right to property. In 2019, it was taken away unilaterally, militarily, and the entire world was quiet. And even if, India said that we are putting these people under siege because we don't want to kill anyone. We don't want people on roads. And normalcy, India's national security advisors said that everything is normal because only one person has died. And the success was accounted to the siege. And just to think about, you just took the territorial sovereignty of people to protect the sovereignty of your state. What's going on here? And I think for me, the answer lies in that we are looking towards settler democracies, and that's what we are endorsing world over. And I think it needs to be said. And when I think about India, I think it's kind of, I think what Goldie Osuri calls post-colonial colonialism. And that also kind of sheds light on the fact that this is a neo-imperial state that has been left to gestate and is now kind of taking shape and form. Now, to speak to the other side of Kashmir, the Pakistani side, or Pakistan administered, I think there's a little labor that we have to always do as Kashmiri or Kashmir scholars, because I think the way that narrative has been presented, and I can't speak for people residing in that place, because as I said, for the longest possible time, there is no interaction between these two peoples. Generations have passed. There are people who are relatives to each other who still meet, but they have to kind of take longer routes. So there is so much, there's so much division that has been created that I don't think there's that sense of unity that probably my grandfather's generation had. But I think a revision of the narrative that has been put forward by critical Kashmir studies scholars in the last 15 years is really looking at what is that other side of Kashmir, and how do they exist on the other side of LOC, and how do we exist on this side of the LOC? And I think one of the primary things that and I'm not speaking for the people in that area, nor am I speaking for the leftists, but what I'm trying to, my vantage is just a critical Kashmir scholar from this side of Kashmir. And what is what's quite visible is that Kashmir did fight for its independence. That Kashmir, because it was the fighters, with the help from whatever percentage of Pakistani army, whatever percentage of what the Indian government calls as the Kabaili raiders, what Kashmiri people also see from the vantage of Jammu massacre and these co-religionists coming in to help Kashmiris, and then kind of fighting the Indian forces. So in that sense, and they did call it Azad Kashmir. They gave it the name of Azad Kashmir, that this is independent Kashmir, independent from the monarch at that particular point in time. And later on, you kind of, the client politicians in this part of Kashmir, they signed the accession. So in that sense, whatever the post-colonial arrangement in this territory, that part of Kashmir, I do prefer to, one, I don't see Pakistan as equal aggressor. I do see that part as liberated by the Kashmiris themselves with help from the counterparts. And I do admit that the Indian narrative has been very hegemonic in the last 72 years to show Pakistan as the aggressor, as if Kashmiris were being saved by the Indian military, and completely invisibilizing the tyranny and the kind of cruelty that was done by their, and also the violence against people. But there was a section of client politicians at that time who were kind of telling people, this is going to be resolved in time, so we just have to be with India. But within 3 years, the RSS really helped the monarch at that time to create the Jammu pogrom. So that, especially in 1947 itself, but I'm talking about the elections that were fought after that, which were also rigged, and the coups that took place. So in that sense, I really think that we do need to look at this region from a Kashmiri vantage. I don't think just a Pakistani vantage or Indian vantage helps. Kashmiris see this history. They don't see BJP, or they don't see the right-wing Hindu nationalists or supremacists as any different from what the secular governments have done. And I think earlier people had problems with thinking about, there are many scholars who would say that Kashmir is not a settler colonial issue. Again, that goes back to thinking about the invisibilization of several layers of immigrations and exoduses that people have done, Kashmiri Muslims as well, from this part of the Indian occupied Kashmir to Azad Kashmir. And that's completely, no one really talks about that. So my question, again, kind of going back, would be like, how is it that in 2019, there could be such a silence when people's territorial sovereignty was taken away by another democratic nation state to protect its sovereignty? Whose sovereignty is important, and what is this hierarchy, and how do we see that? So yeah, that's where I'll stop.
I wonder then if we can go to a question from the chat. Bianca Ramoli.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I'm okay. So my question is for Professor Dillon. So thank you so much for your talk. I'm actually currently in Yellowknife doing my post fieldwork write-up with the JTFN and the Canadian Rangers. So I've been here for like 3 years now. But yeah, so my question is, I guess, kind of self-serving because of my research, but sort of how are you thinking about the like implications or like the consequences of the CAF's, like the Canadian Armed Forces use of Indigenous people, especially for these big exercises, like Nanook or any of the like the End series? Because like you sort of said at the end of your presentation, your point on the enlisting Indigenous people in this colonial project, and then the implications of the fact that Canadian Rangers become military, so they actually can't go against the Canadian state in the way like they have to follow the code of conduct of all military members. They can't do anything political. And like I here during COVID, I saw a lot of that with COVID and Rangers being, or military members in general, being kicked out of the military or charged for speaking out against COVID policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that was kind of my question, if you're thinking about that. And then this might be a state secret, but the crisis on Op Nanook was a sinking cruise ship. I was at the planning meeting, so I heard them talk about it. They fake sank a cruise ship. If you're curious, they did this summer. I was there, so I saw it. Yeah, and then just I don't know if you heard about it, but the AOA course, it's the Arctic Operations Advisor course, is a course that brings Southern military members to the Arctic. I don't know if you heard of that one. Yeah, so we just did it like 2 days ago. We just came back. So it went horribly, but that's a different story. But yeah, that's my question. Sorry.
Wow, no, thank you for all of that. I mean, it sounds like you've been in the region doing some of this work and you're doing your PhD in, can you just give us a little context for where you're?
Sorry, yeah, I've been up here for a long time. I don't really talk to people anymore. I'm doing at UCLA. So Shireen is actually on my committee, which is how I heard about this. And yeah, I'm in anthropology. And I'm doing my dissertation on the relationship between the ranger instructors and the rangers through one CRPG. So just the 3 northern territories, not the rest of Canada.
Got it. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I think that the question you're asking around sort of inclusion and participation of Indigenous communities in the work of Operation Nanook, and I should have explained this, but Nanook actually means polar bear in Inuit, in case you're wondering where that name comes from. I think that is terrain that I'm going to be seeking to understand over the next couple of years. I think it's always a complicated set of questions in the context of colonial violence and historical colonial violence. There are also like the deep problematics around the environmental kind of movement that consistently co-opt and attempt to integrate Indigenous knowledge systems in the service of global climate recovery without any attention to the ongoing, context of conquest and relations of domination and colonial violence that is so much a part of what it means to live in the context of occupation. So I'm hesitant to say too much about what I'm thinking about that yet, because I feel like some of that is yet to come. I have an inclination of what my sensibility about it might be, given my, longstanding work around issues of participation and inclusion. I'm not saying they're gonna, I don't have, I'm not overly optimistic about what that is going to look like. But I do think that, there are, maybe I'll just stop there in response to that. I think it's, and it's also going to have some kind of intergenerational elements too, because, people are situated differently in relationship to their communities and their histories, and also their ideas about the future. And I think, with the context of environmental devastation in the region and climate change and the sort of the arrival of the Canadian Armed Forces in this kind of intense and accelerated manner, that will also change the terrain under which people choose to participate or not.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting because right now there's a lot of what I hear being talked about in my field site is that the Rangers are wanting to leave the organization because they're being put at risk because of climate change, and they're going to spaces that, or during seasons that aren't safe but operationally important to the CAF. And so, yeah, that's an interesting point because I see that a little bit in the relationships that are kind of forming. But thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Yeah,
I think I'd like to pose a question to all of you. Maybe this might even sum up a lot of what's passed today. I'm particularly trying to think very much about the way in which, as I think one article I read recently put it, how liberal thought is actually the resource and for repression and for resistance. So it's like both those things. And when I heard all of you, there was a lot of comment about liberal thought, about things, military occupations, somehow being transformed into democracy, a defense of democracy, protection of people, protection of the environment. It seems inescapable, as you were all describing, this absolutely unrelenting colonial violence, that this was all coming dressed up in another language and another thought, and you were each obliged to take it on. After for a while there, I was thinking to myself, you said at one point, pretty much everything that you have to describe or discuss, you have to pause and maybe put it in quotation marks or something, because it doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean. So I just want to pose broadly that question as a way of kind of tying some of these thoughts together. The relationship between tremendous violence, liberal thought, and resistance. And I'm thinking about how Indigenous peoples, Kashmir, the North, etc., what are the discursive tools that they're using to stand against this. And sometimes those are like liberal tools. So I don't know if you've done any thinking on this.
See that's I thought that I kind of like was talking a little bit about that, but since the paper is really in its infancy, let's think about the icon of United Nations in the Kashmiri situation. So it's been on United Nations agenda since last 74 years alongside Palestine. And what do Kashmiris think about it? Am I kind of on the right track, Shireen?
Yes. I'm trying to think about that as well. It seems overdetermined in your context.
Yeah. And I keep thinking about, so there's like a lot of voices inside Kashmir that had, so I have to lay it out. So please bear with me. So when the autonomy accord was enforced in Kashmir, it meant that it had its own special status, at least the Indian administered part within the Indian context. And Kashmiris had right to franchise, they had right to property, and there were other things. And this was a nominal kind of thing that had it had been eroded till it was taken away. But what remained was the territorial sovereignty. Indians couldn't really come in and take away, buy land. They were doing business and everything in there. They had already done what they needed to do, but still there was that patina of this thing still hanging around. So Kashmiris were kind of very ambivalent about what this autonomy was doing to them. It was also a Trojan horse that was pushed inside Kashmir by client politicians who were Kashmiris at that point in time. But then there was also this motive of United Nations that has been part and parcel of every Kashmiri's lexicon. So there were n number of ideologies permeating around the United Nations, because United Nations also is sort of this glaring behemoth of liberal thought in that sense, and thinking about neoliberal states coming together and deciding what they're going to be doing with these post-colonial entities, so to speak, or with the rest of the world. So for Kashmiris, what United Nations, especially for those who also believe in not having sort of a secular state, but look at it as a Muslim territory, they are also kind of looking towards United Nations as a shorthand, that this is a genuine resistance that is recognized by the rest of the world. And we are also alongside Palestine, because Palestine is seen as a genuine resistance by most of the people, even if whatever they might say, but it is more international, people know about it. So it also is deployed as a shorthand. So in that sense, even if they would be skeptical of what it would do in the end, there was some faith in the system, at least of what it does symbolically for the people. So in the 1990s, you had people actually go to United Nations, and I've said this before and written about this as well. The United Nations headquarters inside Kashmir, it's next to a shrine of this spiritual sage for who's been in Kashmir for the last 600 years. So there's a shrine next to it. So Kashmiris, they would take these memorandums to the United Nations headquarters, which was kind of reminding the United Nations of the plebiscite of right to self-determination. And then people kind of people would say that this is UNO Sahab, like you have the shrine, which is like the Sayyid Sahab, so that you had the United Nations as the UN Sahab. So they kind of, so that was the belief, but there was also this idea that it really does not do much for us because it's a defunct institution, with regards to self-determination or thinking about plebiscite as well. And that's where the question arises, like what kind of mechanisms can we have for peoples like Kashmiris? And I think I asked this earlier in the paper, and this is a predominant concern in my mind, like, do we have to stick to quote unquote the post-colonial regimen that Lord Mountbatten gave these people while running away back to Britain, saying that you either join Pakistan, either join India, and that's your fate. So what do these peoples do? And of course, like thinking about climate change and climate crisis, and the kind of soup bowl that Kashmir has become with its melting glacial bodies and, a little bit inundation by rain, and entire Kashmir is inundated, and things are changing so fast that even glaciers are moving within 4 years. And I'm thinking, like, do we really have that privilege to think about geobodies and nation states and borders? What kind of thinking can Kashmir inculcate into the theorization around democracy, into theorization around thinking about what kind of democracies can exist? And then also, when we talk about the violence of language, it's not only the Indian narrative that permeates into a Kashmiri vocabulary, creating that violence, it's also the violence of democratic vocabulary that has been given to us by the settler neoliberal democracies. And that's what we are peddling forward. And in that, I feel like there is nothing else to do but to give serious thought to decolonial praxis and see what can emerge from within these regions. And I think the indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island, they do lead the way. And we have to, I personally am at the infancy of this stage. I'm still kind of like trying to come out from the mindset of just thinking about these immediate problems that are dogging Kashmir and trying to retell those stories which Kashmiris have told for the last 70 years, but haven't been heard properly, not in the idiom of how the West hears these stories. And I think that's why I had to come here, learn the idiom, then also tell the story, and then also say why I'm not using all the vocabulary because it does violence. So it's really, it's kind of very convoluted, but it did a little bit of that job. But I think the point where we are right now in thinking about Kashmir, especially with its looming climate crisis, looming extractive economy with extracted neoliberal power that has really torn it asunder. I think it's plundering its veins right now, and that's the ultimate that it wants to do. It doesn't want people, as Kashmiris long say, that India wants Kashmir and not Kashmiris. And I think that's what's happening in the moment. And I think in that, I really look towards the decolonial scholars and decolonial praxis to undo what liberal knowledges and liberal democracies have done to us.
Jazz.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. I mean, of course, and I think that's so helpful. The kind of critiques of democracy and the critiques of post-colonialism, Athar, that you're offering are really helping me think about these things too. And I think I absolutely, am resonating with the idea of like, we're all part of these democratic settler colonial projects that are also, they're colonial projects and they're ostensibly democratic at the same time, and how we're all implicated and complicit in those things. And in terms of the kind of liberal thought and coupled with violence and resistance, obviously in the context of Canada, I can't help but think about the politics of recognition and reconciliation and the tremendous amount of discursive and material power that is attached to the politics of recognition. So consultation bodies, participatory politics, inclusionary efforts, shared decision-making power, looking towards a horizon where we're sort of walking hand in hand after apologizing for, all of the atrocious things that have been done. And at the same time, continuing the project of colonial violence in all of its manifestations and forms. And so I think the question is like, what does resistance look like within the context of liberal thought that has dominated how we even think and orchestrate an architecture of decolonial praxis, right? What does that actually look like outside of it? And, and I think that to do that, you really have to, I think, as Athar's suggesting, sidestep the language that forces you to think in particular kinds of boxes. And I think on the front lines, on these, like where you see these frontier logics play out, right? Liberal politics don't work, right? You can't actually, in the context of that kind of struggle, it becomes very difficult to initiate a conversation about, what it means to be included in a conversation when your community is being decimated. So I think part of this is also how we think through what happens in the academy and how sort of knowledge production in particular kinds of spaces also takes on a kind of reproduction, perhaps unwittingly or unintentionally, of a kind of liberal thought around what resistance and decolonial praxis needs to look like and mean, right? And so this is, I struggle with this too. How do you sidestep, how do you get outside of a context that is so deeply, like it permeates everything, and you could look at any number of social movements and find the ways that it actually works from the inside to sort of disintegrate anti-colonial revolutionary thinking from the inside, that pushes a very, very different kind of political agenda that is deeply destabilizing for settler states, right? You see this over and over and again, and that's when force comes out in such overt ways, when people are making demands that don't fit within the logics of something that can be easily co-opted or appropriated or pacified in accordance with. And there are obviously numerous examples of this, but that's what I thought of when you started raising that question.
Sunaina, you have
Yeah,
final words?
you really nailed this question, Shireen, and it's one that's preoccupied me for a very long time. And in that book that I did, The 9/11 Generation, it was basically all about this tension between these kind of imperial and settler, concepts of democracy, human rights, women's rights, gay rights, and then the struggles for liberation. And that's why I wanted to ask about sovereignty. Like, is there a conception of sovereignty that is actually not what has been handed to us? Because even territorial sovereignty, I wonder, so the title of this event had land in the title. And I think sometimes people resort to that, but I was reminded a couple of days ago when I was looking at the amazing flyer for this event that it was actually Land Day in Palestine. And Land Day is not State Day, and it is not Sovereignty Day, it's Land Day, but it is also commemorating an event in 1976 when this goes to Arthur's point about people who are divided by colonial and settler borders. So Palestinians who were colonized inside the 1948 borders of Israel rose up to protest a referendum that was going to confiscate, swaths of their land. And they actually had a mass strike. And it was one of the first instances of collective national organizing within the indigenous population of the Israeli state as established in 1948. And so it's commemorated every year since as Land Day. And then last summer, there was this kind of unity uprising across colonial borders in Palestine, challenging the demolition of houses in Jerusalem and then the war in Gaza. And so the reason I wanted to mention this, sitting over here on Ohlone land, is that I think my work during the context of the Arab uprisings with the Palestinian youth movement helped me understand that the radical edge of that movement was not actually calling for statehood. They were not even talking about territorial sovereignty. They were definitely not talking about liberal democracy, and they were not interested in the Palestinian Authority becoming more democratic. They were actually talking about a different vision of emancipation. And so when I came back here, I've also been struck by the ways in which people are trying to let go of that framework, that you all are rightly critiquing, but we can't just replace it with slogans. So this is my problem, is that I also feel, like we could come up with languages about, decolonizing, whatever, everyone is like, trying to think about decolonization as not being a metaphor, but then what is that? And so one of the things that I was actually struck by, Jess, in your talk was temporality. Like, I was thinking about how you talked about colonial time, and I was thinking, what if the entire framework doesn't work because we're just so stuck. The logics are like so deeply ingrained that even the alternative is framed by the same time. It's within the same imaginary. And so this is going to sound really weird, but maybe Arthur will understand this. I almost think like we need to think about stories and poems. Like, I don't know if we can find it in our existing language. Like, this is why I'm interested in the digital stories with Yemeni community members, because I really want to listen to what they're talking about, because it may not be in our theories,
Appropriate place to end. I want to thank you all for this unbelievable panel. It's left us with so much to think about. Thanks to everybody who lasted through it all. And please don't forget to tune in again for our very last session, which is a keynote address by Dr. Todney Thomas on Black church arson, yet another genocidal front.